on March, in which almost $650 million was stolen, according to the U.S. Treasury. And that's the latest news headlines. I'm Alan Edwards.
Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Claire Dunn, and you're listening to TNC Radio.live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to TNC Radio.live. This is the Truckers Network radio show. And now here's your host, Shelley Johnson.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Yes, this is the Truckers Network radio show on TNC Radio.live, where we offer the news, information, traffic, weather, sports, and entertainment our commercial drivers want to hear. History is one of the topics that we like to cover, and the History of American Holidays by author Jeff Bensch celebrates America's history, culture, and patriotism with thought-provoking stories of the most popular holidays Americans celebrate. Jeff's been a regular guest on our show. He's back with us today to discuss the history of the 4th of July. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thank you, Shelley. Always enjoy being here.
And I enjoy chatting with you. Before we talk about the 4th of July, I thought maybe we could discuss your book, The History of American Holidays, in case the listeners don't know about it. What do you cover in the book?
Yeah, basically, I cover about 16 different holidays that we celebrate as Americans. And with each chapter, I review a little bit of the history and hopefully bring out some new and thought-provoking points. I sort of tie it into current life in America, and I end each chapter with a quote or two to just again provide some food for thought. And I think the overall essence of the book and holidays is it brings Americans together. Each holiday is a unifying moment, and as a country we don't have that common basis. We're the melting pot, right? So holidays give us a chance to celebrate that very fact, and it helps bring us together.
Yeah, holidays typically for all countries historically have always been a unifying factor. Am I correct? Would you say that's true?
Yes, yeah. You have holidays that celebrate different things, whether it's a religious event or a famous person within your country or whatever, and then also just moments of time within your history, like the 4th of July is. So, every country and every religion has their holidays. Absolutely.
And certainly the 4th of July, we know of it as Independence Day. That is something that brings our country together. Of course, people love going to fireworks and celebrating with barbecues and going to the beach and whatever else that they do. But what is the history of the 4th of July? There's more to it.
Yeah, I like to start with, of course, the Founding Fathers and the Declaration of Independence. It is the celebration of signing of that document. And a lot of people think, well, these guys came together and it must be, a miracle that happened, that they all came together at this time, and how, and somewhat of a manifest destiny or an act of God that this all happened with Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, and I think John Adams authoring the Declaration of Independence. But it actually goes back before then, because even though those guys wrote the Declaration of Independence, this other guy, Thomas Paine, basically told them how to do it. And his philosophy, or what he came up with, is basically from a guy, John Locke, who was a philosopher in the 1600s. And some of this thinking goes all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. It just worked its way through the centuries. And John Locke basically wrote a book or treatise on government, and recognizing that people are basically free by nature and that government should exist to promote the public good. Whereas during this time, most government was, power was held in the hands of a king, and so, or a monarchy. And so Thomas Paine brought these ideas of an alternative form of government. He brought it to the masses in colonial America. And we were going through the Revolutionary War, and it was January of 1776, and people were thinking that, I don't know if we can win this. What are we going to do? And Thomas Paine wrote I guess we call it a pamphlet or a short book called Common Sense. And his booklet, about 30 pages long, went viral and by today's standards and sold more than 500,000 copies.
Oh, that was a lot back then.
Oh yeah, huge number, and there are widespread public readings of the book, and basically Thomas Paine championed continuing the war, and the booklet started out with him describing the dangers of monarchy and the importance of religious freedom. And then he had a part in there where he's like, hey, and if you guys are worried about what we're going to do next, here are a couple ideas. And he described the House of Representatives, and he described the Senate and discussed how a president would work. And then he also said, and don't worry, we're going to win this war eventually, because he said, we have the numbers. And one of my favorite lines in the book was basically when he said, we have the numbers, but in unity that our great strength lies. And I think a lot of presidents have recognized that with through the years, and that united we stand, divided we fall kind of thing. Mm-hmm. He put it in his book Common Sense, and then he ended the booklet with a call to people in power to say, we need a Declaration of Independence to let the world know that we're leaving Great Britain. And so that was basically him telling Thomas Jefferson to write a Declaration of Independence. And he even assisted with reviewing and providing input into the Declaration of Independence. And so if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's really a short document. And it's basically a list of the bad things that the King of England was doing.
Right.
And then it's basically declaring at the end, hey, we're out of here. And the thought-provoking thing about that is that if you read that list, a couple of thought-provoking things, if you read the list, you'll see that a lot of those things still occur today. A lot of them don't, but there are a few that still occur. And then also the other thought-provoking thing about the Founding Fathers is that they were basically a group of wealthy white men making laws to secure their freedom from the oppressive government of Great Britain. So they were the rebels making the laws at that time.
Right. Yeah.
And they wanted these laws applied to everyone, but they were basically thinking they were everyone. But then, and so part of it was a little bit of this money grab and control for their own good. But it worked out that it applied to the masses. And that's one of the things that's so great about, the founding of our nation. It applied freedom to everyone. Because usually the laws are written by wealthy people making laws to preserve their own wealth. and prior to 1776, and some would say after 1776, that's the law of human nature, But at the same time, our founding fathers did put everything at risk by going to war. Many of them lost their homes, and some lost their families and their lives to British soldiers.
Oh, yeah. It was a bloody war. I've watched various documentaries as well as, movies about the Revolutionary War. The British, they called them the Bloody English. I mean, they would burn people down in the churches and all kinds of stuff. It was terrible.
Yeah, burning houses and everything like that.
Yeah.
Rod Stewart has a song lyric that says, if you ever saw how wars were won, you would wish peacetime would come. So not many people think about how gruesome war can be. And back then, it was, you were so close together. It was burning things, stabbing people. It was a little more gruesome than shooting someone from far, far away.
Sure.
Yeah.
And really, when you think about it, doing the Declaration of Independence, it was absolutely tyrannical. What we did in this country, it really hadn't been done before, had it?
Oh, what the King of Britain was doing?
To break away like we did and form a democracy. This was uncharted territory, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it was. And today, our Constitution is the longest living Constitution in the world, so we were one of the first countries to break away from Britain or some other, colonial empire, and it was very new.
And England wasn't really willing to give up the ghost because they still tried to pull something in the 1800s.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. I was kind of talking about that as like a friendly jab in the face as we're going back to our corners if we're a couple boxers. But the War of 1812, they actually won that war, but we kind of prevailed in the politics of it all. The British came and had taken over Washington, D.C. there for a short period in 1812.
Yeah.
So, the founding fathers, they really did have to step up and show a lot of heart and bravery to get through the Revolutionary War.
Absolutely. Well, they were making personal sacrifices because they were definitely going against convention, and many of them got their funding from Britain, the wealthier people. So it was, I had even read, George Washington's mother was a loyalist. She was not happy at all with George's stance on things.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She was for the crown. And the country was divided on that. Not everybody wanted independence, because they liked having a king. And what was it, George Washington? At one point, they wanted to know if he wanted to be king, right?
Well, he could have. And that's, if we talk about President's Day some year, that was one of the best things he ever did was he, after his second term, he agreed to step down and have this peaceful transition of power. Mm-hmm. And he set the example because he did have all the power at that time. He was so popular and had done so many great things.
Sure.
And he just said, this is, his farewell address is still read in the U.S. Senate every year on his birthday.
Interesting. I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, because when you think about it, leaders didn't want to give up their leadership. That was not something that was done.
And that might have been a first too, because and a lot of Thomas Paine's Common Sense talks about, like I said, the dangers of monarchy and passing along power from generation to generation and how it corrupts and it's just not good. And George Washington adhered to that in passing along the torch to the next freely elected person who happened to be Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson, a very interesting man, just marvelous. Some of the leaders at that time, they were just amazing people. And they had such great knowledge and foresight, which is just phenomenal. We do have to go to break here, Jeff. There's a lot more that I know you want to unpack about the 4th of July and its history and everything, because it's a very important holiday in the United States. We're talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. We're talking about the 4th of July, Independence Day. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson. Stay tuned for more coming up.
Tips for starting your own trucking company. If you want to start your own trucking company, there are many things to consider. The Truckers Network has put together a list of tips for starting your own trucking company that'll help you get going in the right direction. Have a business plan. Pick a name for your trucking company. Perform a trademark search online to make sure your name's available. Select your target market. Targeting the right market is critical when starting a trucking company. Becoming a special carrier can help you avoid some competition. It could also help you increase your sales opportunities. Make some important decisions. Come up with your rates. Decide if you want to be an owner-operator, and will you do short hauls or long hauls. Know the legal requirements. You must have a valid CDL, commercial driver's license, and if you're going to be an owner-operator, you'll need to follow the terms of the FMCSA. That's the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And you must use United States Department of Transportation and Motor Carrier Authority numbers. That's the USDOT and MC. The USDOT number tracks your safety records and regulatory compliance. The MC number, also known as Operating Authority, classifies your trucking company and the cargo you can carry. To get these numbers, you'll need to register your trucking business with the FMCSA. Get trucking insurance and register with the UCR system after getting your USDOT and MC numbers. Apply for an IFTA. That's an International Fuel Tax Agreement permit. This permit allows your business to get one fuel license, and the rule says you can file fuel tax returns 4 times a year in the state your business is based in. There are several more permits and forms I didn't mention that you'll need based on where you plan to drive and the goods you intend to carry. The FMCSA is a great place to learn more. Funding your trucking business. In most cases, starting a new trucking company takes between $10,000 and $30,000. Keep in mind that this doesn't include buying a semi-truck, only paying the down payment on one. There are many factors that go into the decision of whether or not to buy a new truck or a used truck. If you decide to get a used truck, be sure to thoroughly inspect it, and I would even recommend having a diesel mechanic take a look. Insuring your business assets. A trucking insurance company that specializes in commercial vehicles is the best place to turn to. You can also consult the FMCSA to gain some understanding of what type of trucking insurance is right for you. Another great source of information is trucking forums and social media communities on Facebook. Prepare your truck for the road. Decals displaying your USDOT number, the company's registered name, and your radio frequency ID tags must be displayed on your truck. Don't forget license or international registration plates. You'll also need to install an FMCSA registered and compliant electronic logging device. It's called an ELD. These steps are just a brief overview of starting your own trucking company. The Truckers Network has some great articles that you can read to learn more about trucking in general. And when you become a member, you'll get some great discounts to help you save money so more of your profit stays in your pocket.
It's Truckers Life Radio from TFC Global with your host, Ron Frazier. Monday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Here we're helping drivers as they travel life's highway. I love that. The spiritual side, drivers face a lot out on the road. Truckers Life Radio digs in on the spiritual and moral questions that drivers face on a daily basis. You don't want to miss it. Every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern.
Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. We're discussing the history of the 4th of July, which is coming up. You know, Jeff, there was quite an evolution of how we began. It started with the Declaration of Independence, and then, of course, came the Constitution. It was quite a long process. I don't think people realize it. It didn't all happen at once.
No, not at all. And there's a lot of arguing back then. Right after the Constitution, they had the Articles of Confederation, but that turned out to be not good enough. Didn't really have a central authority for commerce, our currencies and all that kind of stuff. And then, so the founding fathers sort of had to get together again and develop the Constitution. And it was in 1787, about 11 years later, after they won the war and everything, they were struggling with certain issues. So they took 3 months to write the Constitution. And even then, they had to take a bunch of stuff out and say, okay, we're going to have amendments to this and let's get the Constitution approved first, and then we'll immediately put these amendments in. And so certain states decided they would agree to that. And that became the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was approved in 1789, and then it was ratified by all the states in 1791. And the Bill of Rights is where we have the, all the amendments. And today we talk a lot about the First Amendment to the Constitution and the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And so I like to, at this time, kind of reflect on those two and how they sort of go together. Is the First Amendment has, our freedom of speech, but also our freedom of the press. And we hear all this talk about fake news. And anytime someone mentions fake news, they're eroding our Constitution because they're putting doubt into the First Amendment. And we have all this media today, from Fox News to the network channels to social media. We have to be careful to separate the news from the opinion, because the news is so important, and we have to know fact from fiction. And it's not always easy. But
sure,
there are a couple ways to tell. I find that when someone is claiming fake news, they're usually the one doing the faking. They're just diverting attention. And then you got to be careful not to listen to opinions about fake news. And you got to, go to good sources when it's important, and adhere to sources that adhere to journalism standards. And there are a lot of fact-checking services out there. And sometimes I'll get things on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and someone will be posting something, and I'll just say, that can't be right. And I'll do a little fact check, and sometimes they're right, but a lot of times they're not. It's things getting spread, and you got to be careful of that. And then the Second Amendment, of course, is the right to bear arms. And it's very controversial with the mass shootings we have. And when I write my column, this was the one subject that I received the most feedback on. And it was after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And that was way back in 2012, now 10 years ago.
Right.
And the NRA responded by wanting to give every school teacher a gun. And I thought to myself, that's ridiculous. My mom was a school teacher, and you did not want Mrs. Bensch having a gun. I'll tell you right now, that would not have worked very well. So I wrote this thing, and I pulled up this thing with the Archie Bunker, that old show, All in the Family. Mm-hmm. They just put gun detectors at airports, and he didn't like the idea. And he said, he went on the news on the show. So there's Archie in a TV on my TV, and he's saying, we don't need, metal detectors at airports. You're turning airports into prisons and whatever he said. And he said, the answer is that everybody on the airplane should have a gun. And that way, if a hijacker stands up and wants to hijack the plane, the guy next to him will just shoot him, and it'll be over. We won't have any more hijacking problems. And Archie said, the way you could do that, you could just have a bucket of guns at every gate, and you could pick up a gun on your plane and take it out and drop your gun back in the bucket.
People who aren't trained in guns, that's doesn't sound good.
So I sort of got a kick out of it as a kid, and I've always remembered it, or at least remembered it for one of my columns.
Sure.
And I got I have a lot of friends that are gun owners and gun supporters and all that. And,
sure.
And a few of them took the time to write to me, and I got some very passionate feedback, and it was all good. It sort of changed my perspective on guns because of their passion.
Right.
But one of the things they said was, if Jewish people had guns in Germany, Hitler would not have been able to do what he did.
Very true. He put all of the guns in an armory, I believe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've realized recently is that while that argument is there, it's not the whole story, because the first thing Hitler did before taking the guns was he implemented a massive propaganda campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like, you got to recognize, if you're going to kill 1 million people or millions of people, the first thing you got to do is create a lot of hatred.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. And
sure.
And it
with Goebbels, wasn't Goebbels his propaganda king?
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, I believe that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, once the hatred takes hold, the individual guns are not really going to stop the violence, because
sure.
Most people in Germany thought they were doing the right thing because the propaganda had been so convincing over previous decade.
He swayed public influence, and he was able to influence the public and sway their thoughts and attitudes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gets back to the whole fake news thing, the freedom of the press, and to have a press that we can, it's diversified and free, and that we can believe in.
Yes.
Is so important.
Well, the freedom of the press, it's actually part of the checks and balances. It's supposed to keep the government accountable and report back to the people, because the government is supposed to account to the people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's right. And, a lot of things we've done recently and as we evolve is having these, the cable news networks, but also the more regulated network news is so important as well, because different journalistic standards. In addition, they're all kind of corporate sponsored, which is a concern sometimes. And so we have things like NPR and other news outlets that are not adhering to, corporate financing. So to have all of these things at your disposal is somewhat important in the, sort of the complex world we live in.
Sure. Well, and too, with the immediacy of digital messaging, things are out there, and there's not the fact-checking going on in the newsroom. Although when there's a breaking story, that's always been an issue. But I think accuracy, really, with the immediacy of the digital world today, goes out the window. So people are left going, who do I believe? And then they shut their ears, which you can't do that. You have to know what's going on. Otherwise, the system doesn't work, because if you are uninformed, then things don't stay the way they are. I mean, a democracy needs to have an informed public.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, you can't give up. You just got to keep going. And, one thing I kind of tell myself is, if the news is making you angry, and worse yet, if it's making you angry at a person or a type of person, then it's time to take a deep breath and think a little more deeply about it. And maybe it's time to change the channel, get a different perspective. But it's also a good time to, again, remember and be thankful that we do have the First Amendment. We do have the Second Amendment. And
the First Amendment also protects the right to religion.
Yes.
And it wasn't always the First Amendment. What was it? I can't remember the number of it. It got moved around, wasn't it?
Well, I'm going to guess a little bit here, but my guess is it was in the Constitution, and they probably had to move it around as part of the amendments in order to get the first Constitution passed.
Okay.
They passed the first part of the Constitution in like 1788. And this Bill of Rights came along in 1789.
So that was quite a bit of time. And when you think about it, getting everyone to agree with the individual states, were they called states at that point?
States or colonies, but think might have been called states by then. And they did argue a lot, and they had the same arguments we have today. There's the North, more industrial, and South, more agricultural. And then they had the Federalists who wanted the federal government to have more control. And then they argued with the Anti-Federalists who wanted the states to have more control.
Right.
So those things are still argued today about, can a state do this? Well, no, because the Constitution says that. Well, this part of the Constitution says states can do what they want, and we're still arguing about it.
Well, and I think that's what makes the Constitution a living document, because it's open for interpretation, and it can be expanded upon. I think the forefathers did see that as it grew, as the needs changed, as we went forward with different things, as the country grew, it would grow also. Thus, being a living document, it's evolving.
Yeah, very true. And we've evolved, and it has evolved, and that's given it its strength.
Mm-hmm. And one good thing is people in Congress don't beat on each other like they used to. Didn't they hit each other with canes and stuff?
Yeah, they used to, get as passionate as our guys do now. But I think for a while there, we developed quite the civility in Congress, where the words were a harsh enough reprimand. But nowadays, it almost seems like we're going back towards fisticuffs,
Yeah. There was even, weren't there a couple, who was it? There was a shooting in the Capitol. Two congressmen or something. Weren't they arguing? I can't remember who that was or when. But didn't they have to ban guns or something, or the congressman couldn't have those?
I'm not familiar with that, but we did have I do know that a lot of gun control laws, immediately start with guns shouldn't be allowed in, like schools or hospitals or government buildings.
Right.
And that's been kind of a given for many, many years.
Right. Past few decades, I want to say, since the 1990s anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember a history book with an illustration of two congressmen just whacking at each other with some canes. So they were mad at each other. It's like, okay. Which doesn't seem like a good way to have good discourse and accomplish anything when you're giving your opponent brain damage or something, or a black eye. But that's what they did. It was a very heated discussion, and just based on that, the passion that everybody had, and I'm sure even 12 years into it, when the Constitution came around, you still had loyalists that were not happy that we had left England.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard to believe by that time, because we were kind of off and running by then. But also, when you think about a country like the United States, and it's been 200 plus years, and those first few years, we were just in our infancy and really just like a baby learning to crawl.
Sure.
Things.
Well, I think with the Second Amendment, with the right to bear arms, that was, I think, put into place to protect freedom and property, and also because of the fear that there could be a government that was as tyrannical as the British government. They wanted to be able to, people had the right to protect themselves from that.
That's true. And just like, Hitler taking guns away from the people, Britain wanted to take guns away from Americans so they could, control the colonies, the real thing. And oftentimes it was a big argument, should the federal government control the militia, or should each state have their own militia? Right. And then it was like, well, if the federal government controls the militia, what about the state? If the state wants to go to war with the federal government, they got to have their own militia. So a lot of the Second Amendment was set up to, and it even says so in this Second Amendment, to form a ready militia was the primary purpose of the right to bear arms at the time.
It was to keep the government accountable. It was another check and balance, wasn't it?
Yeah, in that, right, exactly. In that you could protect yourself from the government as much as from any, criminal or whatever.
Sure. And Thomas Jefferson, from some of the reading that I have done, was definitely very much in favor of that. As a matter of fact, I think in his later years, he'd said that every free country needs to have a revolution every now and then. It's like, okay. And of course, that's where he was constantly debating with John Adams, who was more for a bigger government. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. Because the southern states were more inclined to want, greater state control. Mm-hmm. And the northern states wanted a bigger federal presence. And a lot of that, actually, we can get into this, I think, on Labor Day, but a lot of that boils down to slavery.
Right.
And even at the time of the Constitution, the founding fathers were arguing about slavery as well.
Yes, they were. It's very true.
And so a lot of that was, well, let's let the states do what they want. That way, that was kind of code for if a state wants to allow slavery, it can. And so that was a lot of the underlying arguments at the time.
Sure. Yeah, and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, when I toured Monticello, I guess they were writing each other back and forth every single day. I mean, it was just a letter frenzy when they would disagree with each other. It was very heated. I think at one point they were almost arch enemies, and then they became very good friends. Or they started out as friends, became enemies, and then became friends again, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and as we were talking off the air, they I think it was those two. I know it's Thomas Jefferson. I think it was John Adams as well. Mm-hmm. They died on the same day, 4th of July.
Yes.
50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
And isn't that ironic that they would both die on the 4th of July? I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who died first, and John Adams died after he learned that Thomas Jefferson had died.
Oh.
I may have it backwards, but that's ironic. And on our country's birthday.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And a milestone birthday.
Oh, absolutely. We do have to go to break here, Jeff. This is a great discussion. We're talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He's written The History of American Holidays. He's a wealth of information. We're talking about the 4th of July, Independence Day. There's a lot more to unpack here. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson here on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. Mental health is a topic that isn't addressed enough in the trucking industry. There are many articles, websites, and businesses that can help truck drivers live a healthy lifestyle. But what about mental health? Mental health issues are not uncommon in truck drivers. In fact, trucking poses several risk factors when it comes to mental health issues. Lack of sleep, loneliness, stressful work environment, lack of physical activity. Truck driving can be rewarding, but health issues such as sleep apnea, obesity, diabetes, and depression can result from the strains of the job. So how do drivers prevent these health issues? Stress is an unavoidable part of trucking. Trucking allows you to see beautiful parts of the country, but it also puts you in many stressful situations. Driving in traffic in unfamiliar cities creates stress on a driver. There's stress when you're not sure if you're going to be able to deliver your load on time. You also can become stressed when you're away from home for so long. As you can tell, there are plenty of stress triggers when you drive professionally for a living. One of the best ways to reduce stress is by learning how to handle it. I realize it's easier said than done. It takes time and self-discipline. Here are some examples of ways you can reduce stress as a truck driver. Listen to music or a podcast. Start eating healthy. Exercise or stretch. Talk with family and friends. Get good sleep. Plan your trip out. In addition to managing stress, there are other ways you can keep good mental health while on the road. Drivers often portray the image of being tough. Mental health is not a discussion that many truckers are going to have. Communicating your mental health struggles with friends and family, therapists, or other drivers is a good way to work through your mental health struggles. Here's some more ways you can stay mentally healthy when you're on the road. Stay in touch with loved ones. Establish a morning and night routine. Bring a pet on the road. Travel with your spouse. Consider team driving. Bring things on the road to keep you entertained, like a laptop, video games, or TV. Occasionally book a hotel room. It's nice to get out of your truck every once in a while. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Drivers need to prioritize their mental health and take the necessary steps needed to be mentally healthy. It all starts with communicating with someone you trust, managing stress, and taking time out of the day to do something nice for yourself. For more information on mental health in truck drivers, check out Common Mental Health Issues Truck Drivers Face on thetruckersnetwork.net. Thanks for listening.
This is Heath Sanders, and you're listening to TNCRadio.live.
Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. As appropriately to talk about a holiday, we're talking about the 4th of July, because that's coming up real fast. And, of course, that's Independence Day for the United States. Jeff, you were saying that obviously Independence Day signified America's freedom, but it also meant economic freedom. When you think about it, that was pretty revolutionary, too.
Yeah, that's right. To spread that economic freedom to the masses, it's kind of a big deal. And in America, you have the freedom to start a business, and then you can go bankrupt, but you don't go to jail. We don't have debtor prisons. So it's kind of thinking about that a few years ago and wondering about bankruptcy. And I heard this podcast about the history of Atlantic City, and I found that interesting. That's a sidebar. But I remembered Atlantic City was all the streets and properties of the board game Monopoly. So I looked into Monopoly a little bit and the history of it, and I found it interesting that the board game was really invented in 1903 by this one woman, a multi-talented woman from Maryland, and her name is Elizabeth Maggie. And she studied the work and the teachings of this guy, Henry George, who in 1879 wrote a book on economics, and it was called Progress and Poverty. And this book, it's quite the book. It's like 600 pages long, and it takes forever to read. But it's really thought out in all his economic philosophies and his proofs of different conclusions. But he was basically examining the contradiction between wealth inequality and poverty during times of, just extreme economic growth and technological progress. This is 1879, and he was kind of looking back, and he's like, wow, at the turn of the century, we didn't have all these things that we have today that make life so much easier.
Sure.
And he observed that capitalism basically drives down costs, and you get the better mousetrap, et cetera. But that usually means driving down the cost of labor. And you drive down the cost of labor to the lowest point allowed by the workforce, and possibly to the point of poverty. And then you can see all kinds of examples in that in your own business. You just think like, I know I was going to use truck drivers as an example. I doubt they stay at 5-star hotels when they're on the road. And they would probably drive as long as they could if there weren't things, laws preventing them from, hurting themselves. But by driving too many hours, I mean. But you look back at like company towns of the 1900s and migrant labor of today, it's always the lowest common denominator is how low the wage will go. And so back in 1879, Mr. George recognized this. And he also recognized that with capitalism, wealth creates more wealth. And so once you get your wealth ball rolling, so to speak, you can create more wealth. And then it's really difficult to stop the separation between the wealthy and poverty. And that gap grows bigger and bigger. And he also recognized that where you have the biggest gaps are in the cities, because you have the most wealth in the city. And you also have the greatest poverty in the city. And he's like, this is not a question of total wealth. It's a question of wealth distribution. And he tied it back then, all the root cause of it all had to do with the value of land. And he thought landowners had a monopoly on land, and that's where the wealth gets created, and that's why you can build on wealth and drive down labor. And so thinking through all that, he came to the conclusion that a property tax or a tax on land is the best economical way and the fairest way to fund a government and also allow labor to earn a fair and sustainable wage. So back to Miss Elizabeth Maggie, she studied all this and she invented this board game to demonstrate it. And that original version of the game is that you'd go around the board in two different ways. One way you'd go around the board, and every time you had to pay rent for a hotel or a house or whatever, that money would go into the center, into the community chest. And the goal was, after 5 times around the board for all the players, as a group, to see how much money you could get into community chest. And then the alternative way to play it is everyone goes around the board independently, doing their own thing, and you play until one person has all the money and everybody else is bankrupt. And she thought that would be a great way to show that it's better to pool your money into the community chest. Well, it didn't work out that way. Everyone wants to play a game and have a winner and a loser. So I guess, sort of the rest is history. We all play the game till everyone's bankrupt.
Right. Yes, of course, the famous mustached man, and I'm the phrase, do not pass go, do not collect $200, right?
Yeah, go directly to jail.
Right. I can't tell you how many times I ended up in jail playing that game.
Yeah, you always needed those get out of jail free cards.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And those weren't shared easily.
That's great. You mentioned all that. So she invented the game in 1903, and then it gained popularity just by word of mouth on the East Coast. And then in 1933, so 30 years later, Charles Darrow added the artwork and spruced up the boards, and then he came up with the idea of giving the property names around the board of those properties in Atlantic City, which was a very popular destination resort at the time.
Sure.
And so then he sold his version of the game to Parker Brothers, and sort of the rest is history. They sold over 270 million copies, but they've also had to go through a bunch of patent battles that were too numerous for me to read. So,
I imagine there were people trying to jump on board as soon as they saw some money to be made off of Monopoly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know before the game was actually mass distributed, who played it. Were they people from all walks of life that initially played the game? Do you know?
Yeah, sort of my understanding of it was like a cloth board that you could roll out, and it had all the pieces inside. Mm-hmm. And it was played at, my impression of what I read a little bit was more of a wealthier class of folks, and it was like an after dinner board game that they could sit around the table and play when friends would come over for dinner and things like that. That based on the little bit I read on how it gained popularity, that's what I got from it. The one thing I'd like to follow up on monopoly is that today, bankruptcy is not the end game. With everyone bankrupt and one guy has all the money, we do have that in a little bit of a way with our income inequality being a major issue in society and things like homeless problems and that. But we are fortunate. We have bankruptcy laws that protect us, and it allows entrepreneurs to go out and try something new and develop better products and services and grow and continue the economy. And so we can be proud, of our resilience and our perseverance in continuing, our economic engine.
You had something to say about proud to be an American. I think that's really appropriate for the 4th of July.
Yeah, I was wrapping this up. We just talked about monopoly and how we can be proud of our economy and the way it works. And it's not perfect. But as we celebrate 4th of July, there's a lot to be proud about and being proud Americans. And, everyone has their own answer to this question and its own unique meaning and its source of inspiration for all Americans. And, whether it's freedom, liberty, those are often the dominant themes, or equality, inclusion, caring are also frequently given answers. But America is unique because, as we said earlier, we're not necessarily a nation formed or held together by ancestry or race. We're the great melting pot held together by beliefs. We believe in democracy, unified values, and informed participation. So these are the things that make us all proud to be an American, and 4th of July is the time to celebrate.
Well said. This has been a great conversation, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. We've been talking with historian and author Jeff Bensch. He's written the history of American holidays. We've been discussing the history of the 4th of July, which is extremely interesting. You've been listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. Thank you for listening to another great interview on tncradio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on tncradio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of tncradio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. Radio.live.